It was an early spring day, and there was a lot going on in the office. There was just some weird energy going on, and at one point, there was this strong breeze that came through the window. I had this sense that God was saying, it's time to go. It's time to move on. The time is now. And I really did have that sense at that moment that it's time to maybe consider the priesthood again, and maybe it's time to do that.
I think I knew I wanted to be a priest since around the third grade.
I remember telling my babysitter when I was probably even before first grade, I said, I want to be a priest when I grow up. And she says, a priest? Yeah. And I left it there.
I often wondered why, when I was even young, when I was only about 10 or 11 years old, we had a small room down in the basement cellar of our house. And I can remember very early on building an altar there. A small altar, getting a piece of marble, buying little tiny candlesticks, making it just like an altar. And I would spend time praying down there. Now what motivated me to pray? I don't know. It wasn't coming from my family so much.
I'm 38 years old now. But it started way back when I was a junior in college.
I ran away from the thought and tried to run away from it anyway, but it wouldn't go away.
My parents had a lot of questions about it.
So I was, again, waking up very early and going to Mass. And my dad was like, we're going every morning, you're becoming a fanatic, So, but I just told my dad, I said, listen, Dad, I feel called there. I got to go.
I wanted to learn about it for a while and decided I would give it a try.
Oddly, I didn't probably do the reading that one should do, or the searching and the testing that one should do before entrance. All I can attribute it to is providence that somehow, in my case, I think it's worked out.
Why would a young man join the priesthood? And what does it mean to be a priest? As nuanced as these questions are on an individual level, they gain even greater complexity when regarded on a generational scale. From the 1940s to today, in only the span of a single lifetime, the Catholic priesthood in America has undergone great change in social status and privilege, in popularity, and perhaps most significantly, in how it persists, how it finds new members. The discernment process has undergone as much change in the American Church as the priesthood itself in the past 80 years. And if one is to understand how it works today, one must begin many years ago, at the American Church of the mid-20th century, when Catholicism itself was vastly different from today.
The priests from that era would have come from a Catholic culture. That's an important word that we use, a culture. And there was a Catholic culture in the United States. So, in other words, there was kind of a cohesive, intact system of friendship, values, convictions that would define the Catholic community. So, up until the mid-70s, you were born in a Catholic hospital to Catholic parents. You grew up in a neighborhood that was heavily Catholic. We had 10 families on my block, and 6 of them were Catholic. You hung around with Catholic friends. You went to a Catholic grade school. You played basketball on a Catholic team. You dated Catholic girls. You went to a Catholic high school, and if you could, to a college. You married a Catholic. Then you started it all over again. That's an intact Catholic culture.
When I was around a junior, I guess, I began to think about what am I going to do with my life. This inclination to prayer, this inclination to building a little altar, to the priesthood, goes way back when I was very young. But not knowing where to go or what to do, I went to the student counselor at the high school, St. Michael's, and he gave me a small booklet. It was called The Guidepost. That may still exist for all I know. The Guidepost was a booklet which contained all the male religious orders in the United States. It was quite a big book, because there's quite a lot of them. You'd have one page with a picture of somebody in that order, and then the other page would be a short history, and then something about the kind of work they do, things like that. So I finished my high school, and then from that book, on the back of the book, they had addresses you could write to. So I wrote to 501 East Fordham Road, which at that time was the provincial headquarters, to Father Henneberry, and I got a reply inviting me for an interview. So I came up with my mother. So I would say I was probably about junior year, senior high school. It was a different world. I mean, you began thinking of religious life much earlier. You made decisions much sooner. And you were accepted much more quickly. Nowadays, they wouldn't even look at you at that age, So that's my vocation.
To be a priest was a noble call. To be a priest was something that every family wanted to have. To be a priest was common. So when I graduated 8th grade in 1964, 5 of us boys from that class entered the seminary. All right? High school seminary. And that was no surprise. All right? It was just something we did.
I think we would say that in the 50s and 60s, in some sense, it was a heyday of the Catholic Church in the United States. Catholics for the first time were really accepted in the culture. We had John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic president, and institutionally, the church is very strong.
It was the water you swam in. In the 1950s, one of the most popular shows on television in prime time was Archbishop Fulton Sheen talking. That's absurd today. I mean, we can't even imagine that.
I think, though, in all that, the undercurrent of like choosing Jesus Christ, choosing to be Catholic, it wasn't a choice people had to make necessarily. It was like fitting in with the mold that was put on. And in society and culture, it was just kind of assumed if you're going to be a good citizen, that faith had to be a part of it. So in the 60s and the 70s and all the cultural revolution, the sexual revolution, distrust of authority of all different types, when that mold, when that structure was taken away, well, what was left?
In my day, most people did join right out of high school. Was the custom. I think part of it had to do with the whole thing of the 60s. You've heard of the 1960s, I'm sure. It was a wild time.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I
And everything changed. It wasn't just the music. It wasn't just the drug scene. It wasn't just education. It wasn't just civil rights. It wasn't just women's rights. Everything, the whole world turned upside down during the 60s. And I think part of that was realizing that in most cases it would be better if people were just a little bit more mature when they made the decision. While we have fewer people flying now, we're also a little more careful about who we actually do accept. My parents were not happy at the thought that I was thinking of entering a religious order, right out of high school. So they told me to go visit the pastor of the church, and he was an excellent fellow. And he said, "Yeah, go ahead, go to college, go to Georgetown, and if you have a vocation, it'll be there after 4 years. And if you don't have a vocation, you'll have lost it by then." By the time I came along, things were changing, and the orders were starting to look for people to complete some years of college, if not all of college, before entering. So the class that I entered, it had 13 people in it, and 4 of them were coming right out of high school, and the other 9 were coming out of college.
Since Father Bavinger joined novitiate in 1969, the average age of entry has only grown. Today, it is far more common for men to join a seminary or novitiate out of college, or even many years after college. High school seminaries, which numbered over 100 in the 1960s, fell to fewer than 10 by the early 2000s. And as the age of entry rose, the rate at which people entered seminary began to fall.
No, I think if you lived through the 60s, you realize it was just a different time. The 60s were just like, it was just wild. It really was wild.
There was a huge amount of resistance to the Catholic Church during those years, especially resistance to authority.
In many ways, the pre-Vatican II Church could be very, very rigid. I would hear stories as provincial. It was like suddenly, young guys, their brother would die or their mother would die, and they weren't allowed to go home for the funeral and something like that. It was just like crazy. What kind of compassion is that? And so a lot of people just said, I'm voting with my feet, as did many people in other cultural groups.
I feel bad. Like recently we had the statistics from the province. We had 8 novices this year. 8 people entered. That's the whole East Coast. I was 60 when we were only in New York. And now we're at the whole East Coast and we only have 8. Well, 8 sounds like a good number, except that at the beginning of November, they give you the list of all the people who died for All Souls Month. 17 died. So you have 8 coming in, 17 dying, so you're losing. You're losing every time.
This archdiocese is now furiously scrambling when they have any priest, pastor who has to be replaced. And they're combining parishes. Religious orders are no longer able to staff parishes in dioceses where they may be. The Franciscans pulled out of a lot of different parishes because they are all shrinking as well and not a lot of young people coming in. So what's going to happen is you're going to have giant parishes with 1 or 2 priests serving what used to be 3 or 4 parishes. That's going to be the reality until something changes.
From 1965 to 2022, the number of American priests declined from 60,000 to 35,000, and ordinations declined from around 800 a year to about 500 a year. All this happened while the general American population increased by over 100 million. Today, the number of priests continues to shrink because a disproportionate share of priests are retired. These conditions have alarmed many Catholics, but some see more nuance to the issue.
People would say, aren't you depressed that the numbers of Jesuits are going down? I said, no, I think if you look at the history of the society, we had this huge blip after the Second World War. And so, the GI Bill made it possible and all these guys came in. And so, you'd have 120 Jesuits all teaching at Fordham. Like Ignatius never imagined something like that. The fact that you had all these Jesuits at a school, it was nice, but that we're getting back to homeostasis.
Before the Second Vatican Council, people were accepted I wouldn't say willy-nilly, but with maybe an interview with the provincial, kind of a say-so by someone in a Jesuit school. And I think they just realized after the Second Vatican Council, and as, we got more sophisticated about psychological things and formation, that, we wanted to have higher standards. And so now in the Jesuits, it's a battery of interviews and, psychological tests and recommendations from family and friends on top of a long process, a vocation process where the Jesuits get to know you, right? So you go to meetings and you do retreats and things like that. You go through spiritual direction because, we want to have high standards and we want to, accept, only guys that are going to be, a good fit for us.
The fact that vocations are down and there's fewer priests who are ordained and coming into ministry is putting a huge downward pressure on what the church is able to do in the United States. This is not the case in other parts of the world. We go to other places in the world, vocations are not an issue.
So one of the blessings of the recent synod was the vibrant presence of bishops from Africa. And I'll never forget one of the African bishops saying, I hear you bishops from Europe and North America say you're closing churches. I can't open them fast enough. I hear you say you don't have enough priests. I got more than I know what to do with.
The church isn't dying, it may be dying in the United States. And the Church of the Rust Belt, where immigrants first entered the United States in the last century, we're finding that those dioceses are shrinking in terms of vocations, but in the southern part of the United States, it's the other way around. So, sometimes it looks that bad right here where we are, but it may not be that way in New Mexico.
In terms of why there are lesser numbers of seminarians, I think we need to be very nuanced in how we approach the question. For example, I think that there are some who would say, well, it's definitely due to celibacy, for example. That's the number one reason why you won't see young men interested in priesthood. And that's certainly true for a given segment, but it's never been a complete explanation for all groups of the church. For many Black young men, another major reason for that entry into the priesthood was that they were never asked. That white young men were more likely to be asked to enter into the seminary than Black young men. That was my experience, for example.
I remember one time my provincial, I was a New England province Jesuit, said, I'll never forget this, religious life is being restored to its proper minority status in the church. That there were never meant to be thousands of people in a monastery, that it was supposed to be kind of a small group of people. I thought that was really helpful. I think that the Holy Spirit might be calling lay people, right, to a more active participation in the church.
What concerns me is that few people are going to church. And it's this weird phenomenon where, as the cultural expectation of devotion to faith or the status of religion in society is changing and dwindling, if you're serious at all about, say, being a Catholic or being any sort of religion, you're always considered, well, you must be almost like a professional, and therefore you should be a priest. Well, the bigger crisis is having kind of a culture or communities that are healthily observant and devoted and prayerful and spiritual, and from those to have kind of naturally emerge vocations. That's more alarming for me than the vocations per se.
It's interesting because I do spiritual direction for some of the men in formation over in Chiswick Hall here who are doing their first studies. And so they're mostly in their mid to late 20s. There are some who are older. But the one thing I'm very aware of is just what different generations we are and what a different world they have grown up in than the world I grew up in. And I only partially understand it. And so all the things that have happened in the last 20 years to complicate the call to religious life, let alone this is, the American cultural context, which in general is not very supportive of priestly or religious vocations.
There are many more distractions, the phones and all these things that keep distracting you. Many more temptations. And then even the understanding of sex has changed so radically. In our time, the whole thought of sex before marriage, it was just unheard of.
I think now it's probably hard to believe in God. And I think many of our youth feel that God is not present in my life. And part of that comes from families that are broken. A lack of fatherhood as well. I mean, boy, it's really sad to see in our youth today being unable to say there is a God, mostly because the men in their lives are not present. How can you believe in Jesus, who is a man, if there's not a man in your life who represents Jesus to you, right? So I think that's a real challenge that we have, having a family and raising them. The commitment, marriage, the sacrament of marriage is certainly going downhill. And so if you can't even have a family where there is a marriage and that commitment, well, how do we expect our youth to even consider the priesthood, and the commitment of marrying the church?
I think another factor is maybe a turn to the self of trying to find fulfillment in just kind of seeking one's own desires, devoid of any true, committed, lifelong love. And I think I see this in terms of the priesthood, religious life, and marriage. You see decline in all those three. We now, for many generations, have been telling people to just follow what makes them happy, or follow the things that would kind of fulfill them. Follow a career, or follow things of interest that you can make a living of and you can be successful about. I don't hear a lot about the idea that what makes us truly happy is giving ourselves away.
We're a secular society now. But in a secular society, what's the role of the priest? And then, of course, we have to deal with all those scandals, and that has hurt. That has hurt so much.
Catholic leaders in Texas released the names of almost 300 priests accused of sexual abuse, and they issued a new apology to victims.
With the grand jury report due out soon, the Diocese of Harrisburg today identified 71 priests and others among the accused.
Horrific sexual abuses of children by hundreds of priests.
I express profound sorrow, and I apologize to the survivors of child sex abuse.
We've realized the harm that priests can do. Both in communities and in the church. And that, I think, is what the younger generation, sadly, it has inherited, that legacy of people, and I'm not blaming it all on that, but it's kind of emblematic of it. People kind of being disenchanted with the church, a lot of suspicion of clergy and religious life.
And then certainly since the sex abuse crisis, right, the predominant image of the priest is as the pedophile and the child abuser. And so really I think it's for many people, in terms of status, it's kind of a step back.
For 8 years, I was president or superior general of the Paulist Fathers. So I was overseeing all of the folks who are applying. But I do think the scandal in the church is a big, heavy weight on vocations right now.
Public image of the church has been more negative the last 2 decades. than it was previously. That doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it harder, I think. And you can imagine people hesitating more before choosing priesthood or religious life. I think that's true.
But I think a vocation is individual, and I think what we're called to do is to trust that God is doing for the church what God is doing for the church. And in every age, whatever the vocation situation is, there's something for the church to learn from that particularity.
With the collapse of the Catholic culture, that kind of external prop and encouragement to priestly vocations would have gone. Do we miss it? Yeah. But perhaps it's a blessing in disguise. Because now the decision to become a priest would not be something imposed from the outside. It would not be something that would kind of just been expected. It's something that is a radical choice.
In recent decades, the radicalism of the priesthood has become more pronounced. A recent survey of priests across the United States found that in over 60 years, the share of American priests who identified as politically conservative increased from 15% in the early 1960s to over 50% in the modern day. The share that identified as theologically conservative, or orthodox, increased from 20% to over 80% in the same time period.
And the other challenge, at least for us, is like, you're not rigorous enough. We want to be on our knees all the time. We want to be deprived. We want the extreme religion. I want to join that group who's doing the extremes. And we're trying to just be pastoral and inclusive and welcoming and all those sorts of things. So that may not be, where a lot of young adults are coming out of at this time in their lives.
Younger Catholics are more interested in a kind of what is identifiably Catholic, right? So these particular practices, which gives them the sense of home, right? That they're comfortable with that. Whereas in my generation, a lot of those things were kind of, they just weren't in the foreground. It wasn't a choice people had to make necessarily. It was like fitting in with the mold that was put on.
I almost have the remembering that I entered the order without much faith at all.
It's very unpopular to be religious, right? And so a lot of people, especially, during college, I know this from my own experience, basically had to fight against the world sometimes, because the world tells you don't, right? The world tells you it's not true. But when you just keep feeling that, and you're feeling God's presence there, you just know in your heart it's true.
It's something that is a radical choice. And actually, discipleship and being an apostle is always a radical choice to come follow me. So in the long run, it may be for the better.
A lot of people, I think, nowadays would not understand that step. Just speaking, about my colleagues at the university, I think not most of them, but a lot of them that I talk to, they don't even know what a Jesuit is or a priest is. And so the idea of priesthood is really foreign right now.
If you were to introduce priesthood to someone who's unfamiliar, what would you say?
That's a good question.
First of all, it means to be a good Christian, to be a follower of Christ, to love God, love your neighbor.
Certainly fatherhood, right? That's how we call our priests father. And what does that mean for a diocesan priest, but being the father to a community?
Well, a priest he's obviously someone who offers sacrifice. He offers himself. As Bishop Sheen would say, a priest is a priest victim. He's ordained in the persona Christi. He gives himself over. He gives himself to the Lord.
Whether it's at the altar and private conversation, the hospital, funerals, baptisms, there's all these kind of moments where a priest intersects with people. And just the gift of everybody's faith that I encounter is its own reward. But I would say the heart of the priesthood is praying with people. Simple as that.
Pretty sure that to be a discerning person, you need to be a praying person.
So a lot of people think that vocation means you have to have a vision or you have to hear a voice. I mean, literally, like hear a voice, or there has to be some big sign. But really, it's this desire. It's the attraction. It's the appeal. And that's how God calls you. It's the happy inability to think of anything else.
For me, the one I keep pushing with so many was just get to know Jesus. That's all. Just pray about the Gospels. Because if you're going to have the reason you have a vocation at all is because you have established such a friendship with Jesus, who calls us friends, and then we realize what it is to be a friend, that I just want to be with him. I want to offer my life to him in some way.
I think whatever your vocation is, if it's you're going to marry someone or priesthood or religious life, there should be peace there. And that comes from the Lord.